All right, guys, back here on the Establish the Pass podcast, presented by Clutch Points. I'm your host, Blake Lovell. With me, as always, my co-host, Dillon Reagan. And here, Dillon, we're not that far away from the start of the season. Hard Knocks is here. That means that, it's time to start having questions about who could get fired and who's on the hot seat, because that's what we like to do this time of year, because we know expectations are high for every team. And so we thought it'd be interesting to make a short list of coaches and quarterbacks specifically, knowing the value and expectations that are placed on those two entities, and trying to figure out who's going to be kind of feeling the pressure this year going into the 2024 season. There's some interesting options potentially on the coaching side and when it comes to the starting quarterbacks for some of these teams.
Yeah, I can't believe it's only like 2 weeks till training camp. Usually when Hard Knocks starts, we're actually in training camp, a little different, obviously this year. But yeah, before we get into our bigger kind of previews per conference or by division, depending on how we go this year, it is interesting to kind of look at the faces that might not be with us, at least in their current positions for much longer. We have a lot of coaching turnover this year, right? We had 7 new head coaches, or at least a number of them coaches that had previously had head coaching jobs but are new to those positions. And we have 6 quarterbacks drafted in the first round. So a lot of quarterback turnover as well. So these are the 2 spots that, we could dive into GM stuff. I know a lot of times GMs are able to survive longer than coaches do. You don't see the turnover quite as high, but often obviously those are quite important too. But yeah, these are kind of the 2 spots that usually we'll look at where, unlike a lot of positions in the NFL, there's only one starting quarterback, only one head coach per team. The demand and the importance of these is obviously really high, and the scrutiny and pressure, like you're mentioning, it definitely can kind of bubble and build. And for some of these guys, it's been building for a few years. Some of them, if you told us last year that we'd have the Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni on here, I don't think we would have believed it. But things change quickly in the NFL.
Well, let's start with him, because I think it's very interesting, right? Because you just said it. I mean, it's like, this is how it works. Like, these guys can just sort of out of nowhere join this list here. And I think he is one that, knowing, again, kind of the way things unfolded last year, it's the NFL, and you said it, like, it's just where things can change so quickly. And so now going into this season, knowing that where they were not that long ago to kind of the disappointment of how last season unfolded, I mean, he's clearly on this list. It is wild to think, but it is also a franchise that's invested a lot of money. We know Saquon's joined the mix, all that. Like, we know where the Eagles want to be right now, but man, it is kind of wild that he's even considered here, but rightfully so. I think he is.
Yeah, I think, after losing both of his coordinators a year ago, after their Super Bowl run, things got a little bit exposed. I know they bring in Vic Fangio, and hopefully they'll help out on the defensive side. Offensively, it was a question mark with him going back and forth between play calling duties. It was kind of a mess there. But yeah, it was a team that really lost a lot of the efficiency we saw from the prior year on offense, where at times we saw them be quite successful still early in the season. Obviously, they built up, I think, around a 10-1, 9-1 record before things kind of fell apart down the stretch. But the defense really tired out. That was the one side where you felt like they had such a solid unit the year before. They'd found a lot of bargain guys that really contributed to that Super Bowl run. And their secondary really fell apart. I know they had some injuries, but definitely, you talk about, like, we wouldn't have expected having him in this conversation now. There was a chance that he wasn't going to make it past last season. It was pretty hotly discussed in terms of whether the Eagles were about to move on just last year, especially with certain coach from New England being available. But yeah, there's still a lot of pressure here. I do think, but depending on, we can get into the Cowboys in a second here, depending on what you think about Dallas, if they're going to take a step back or not compared to a year ago, you might think that the Eagles have a pretty prime chance to win this division after falling out last year and then losing in the first round of Tampa Bay. But I don't, honestly, maybe that's not enough for a team that really has Super Bowl expectations, or at least had them going into the last couple seasons. And still, even with some of the retirements they have, obviously Jason Kelce won't be there anymore, still have a really solid offensive line, still have a ton of talented playmakers. There's no and obviously they bring in Saquon. I mean, this is a group in an NFC that outside of the 49ers and the Lions, maybe you could throw the Packers and Rams into the conversation. There's not a ton of teams, as we've talked about, that you feel like are really prime Super Bowl contenders. And the Eagles certainly consider themselves that. And I don't know if just winning the division is going to be enough for Sirianni. They might have to win a playoff game this year and kind of bounce back and show that they're not going to fall to kind of middle of the pack. But, I still think this is such a good team. I know that the record last year early on in the season didn't really reflect some of the advanced numbers for their EPA per drive, and especially on defense and just their overall DVOA. But this is a team that I think has the players in place, and now maybe with Vic Fangio, things will get settled down, but still plenty of pressure on Nick Sirianni to prove his worth as a quote unquote CEO kind of head coach. Whereas, maybe this is, we know for sure in terms of, I know I mentioned GMs, we know Howie's not going anywhere. We know that if things don't go according to the plan this year, who's going to be the man to blame? And it's probably going to be Nick, and whether that's fair or not, you can debate, but definitely a pretty quick fall from grace from, making the Super Bowl 2 years ago to this conversation now.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. Again, that's how quickly things can move in the NFL, though, and we know that. We were having a conversation about this next guy before we started recording, and I was like, so what is this, his second year, third year? Like, it all runs together sometimes. You're like, no, actually, it's his fourth year. He's been with this team, and that is Robert Saleh with the Jets. Now, we both know, if you go back in the conversation we had before he was hired, we thought this was just a fantastic hire, and I don't know that I've changed my mind that much on that. I still think he was a good hire, but now it is kind of that point where 4-13, 7-10, 7-10, and we know there have been reasons, injuries, a big part of that because of Aaron Rodgers last year and such, and how different things could have been. But that is 3 straight losing seasons, and so now Rodgers returns. We see kind of how they filled out the roster. And this does feel like a very important year for Robert Saleh to try to turn things around because, again, there have been kind of some reasons, understandably so, why they've come up short in the past couple of years. We've seen them kind of be right there on the edge of maybe turning the corner. They just haven't been able to do it. But you would have to think if it's not this year, I don't know, that there will be a little bit more pressure added to the mix, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think you could make different arguments about what the job Joe Douglas has done since coming over from New England. But I think at least at this point with the team, the roster they have this year, the argument could be made that they have a really talented group that should be able to win. So, yeah, the pressure is mostly on Saleh, at least in this moment, especially defensively. I think that's been kind of a saving grace for him in terms of him still being there. That's his side of the ball that he came over from San Francisco as the expert on, and they finished third in DVOA behind only Baltimore and Cleveland. So, they had a unit there that was getting the job done. They just needed an offense to do anything, and sure enough, they finished dead last. So even below Carolina and DVOA, which is kind of crazy to think about. But at the same time, if you remember watching either of those teams when they had the football, it wasn't a whole lot of fun. So, yeah, the Rodgers injury is part of it, and it's a lot of hopes and dreams that are put into having him. I think they brought in Tyrod to be a backup, though, so they have a little better. Have to double check that, but I think they have a little better backup plan than they did a year ago in case Rodgers isn't able to stay out there. I know there was a lot made of him missing the mandatory minicamp. Doesn't sound like there'll be any issues going into the season outside of that, but they bring in Mike Williams. This is an offensive line that, you could say should be pretty solid, has some big names and guys that have been there a while, and should be a group that gets the job done. Obviously, Breece Hall, when he's healthy, has been a dynamic back for them. We know what Garrett Wilson can do. They bring in Malachi Corey from the draft. This is a really talented group. It's just on paper and what happens on the field, though, are two different things. So, yeah, it's a really tough division, really tough conference. I don't think Buffalo and Miami are going anywhere, so that makes things tough. But solid, they beat Buffalo even without Rodgers in Week 1 last year. I think this defense is going to come out hungry. We do know that year to year it's hard to have the same consistency on that side of the ball. Sometimes things will naturally fluctuate a bit. So even if they don't finish in the top 3 again on that side, I think at least the bar here for the Jets is getting to the playoffs. I think for Saul, if you had to look at what needs to happen for him to maybe get himself off the hot seat, or at least feel like the seats cool down a bit, And it's going to be tough, but I think the Jets have to at least get to the playoffs. I don't know if you think they might need to do more than that, but I think it's hard to have an expectation we're going to win this division over Buffalo after they've won it 4 years or however many years in a row, and what Miami's been able to do. I think the playoffs for sure have to be an expectation at this point. And year 4 for Saleh, as you mentioned, it feels like it's been less time than that, but things move quickly. And for the Jets, they're, especially if depending on how long Rodgers feels like he has, if they get to a point, it's another struggling year and they still feel like they're going to have one more shot with him, they might take a chance on a different coach. We'll see.
Well, a coach that had significant pressure added to him as if he wasn't already feeling it, and he's someone else we thought that may have gotten fired before we get to this point, is Matt Eberflus in Chicago. And we know now, anytime you draft a quarterback, number 1 overall, the clock starts ticking because, that is kind of a situation now where the Bears 3-14, 7-10 in his 2 seasons there. So 10-24 overall. They finished last in the division each of the last 2 seasons. But now you've got the restart on offense with Caleb Williams coming in. Rome Odunze joins him. They've added some interesting pieces offensively. Can the Bears take that next step? I mean, it's much harder to do now in this division. We talk about just kind of the strength of the division as a whole, but needless to say, anytime you go out, and I mean, it's not the same scenario, right? But we saw this kind of with Frank Reich in Carolina. They drafted Bryce Young. It was a complete mess early, and he didn't have his job at the end of the year. A little bit different scenario, but I would have to think if the Bears don't make progress this year, and whether we think that's a playoff spot or if it's just winning 9 games or something, I don't know. Is 5-12 going to have Matt Eberflus keeping his job next season? I would think probably not.
Yeah. And I think at least you can make the argument with the Panthers roster that there's not a lot to work with weapon-wise and with that line, whereas here, some questions on the offensive line still, but a group that I think is better than it has been over the last couple of years. I think they've improved, and we've seen some guys step into roles pretty well, but it's playmaker-wise, they are not lacking with a group that people are arguing that they have one of the best, maybe the best trio of receivers in the league, and that's a lot to expect from a rookie in Rome. But they're at least in that conversation quickly, or at least I've seen that be mentioned. It's like, wow, it's kind of crazy to think about for a team that doesn't have, as we've talked about a few times, not a lot of history of passing the football in this franchise successfully. So they bring in DeAndre Swift as well. Still have Khalil Herbert there, and Cole Kmet's been able to do some good things. They bring in another receiving weapon and Gerald Everett at tight end. They have Mercedes Lewis for the still keeps going at UCLA Bruin that I watching when I was like 13 years old, played for the Bruins, and now he's still in the NFL. It's kind of crazy, but he'll be more of a blocking tight end potentially for this team. But yeah, it's I think expectations for Eberflus are maybe not so high of playoffs or bust for his job, but I think it's what you're kind of mentioning about what happened in Carolina, what's happened to some of these other number 1 picks. They have to look more competent than that, and I think with these weapons, with Caleb, bringing in Shane Waldron, I like to think that they're going to be able to be solid. Who knows what the actual ceiling is for them on that side. On the second half of the year, the defense improved a lot, and I think Eberflus got a lot of credit for that. So there's enough things that they felt like, as a leader of the room, he was going to do a good job. I know at the time we were still a little conflicted of, all right, you're bringing in a rookie quarterback, and you don't have a offensive play calling head coach. Is this going to lead to a cycle? If you have success, best case scenario, you do have success, but then you might lose Shane Waldron to another team, and you're just going to have to always cycle through different coordinators. And if you don't have success and you're starting, to say in year 2, kind of back at square one, which you've seen happen and be fine for, think about Trevor Lawrence, and Jacksonville is probably the biggest example of that, with how terrible things were under Urban Meyer before Doug Peterson got there. And obviously things have been a little topsy-turvy, but nonetheless improved dramatically after year 1. So that was kind of the argument. It wasn't even something against Eberflus, but more of just like the philosophy of a team build for a rookie quarterback. But I think for Eberflus, they just have to be in the mix. Caleb ideally has a pretty solid season. I know we talked about rookie QB expectations and him possibly getting, with the low barrier for having the most passing yards in the season by a Bear ever, it's at least possible for him to get into that. I think it was like 3,700 yards, 3,500 yards with this team, with these weapons. I don't know if they'll get quite there, but nonetheless, and they definitely are a playoff contender. I think when you look at the list of teams that can make it in the NFC, it's not so deep that you can't see a scenario where Chicago finds a way to get in there, and that would really help Eberflus, obviously. But I think the pressure's still on because of just the fact that we were so close to, it took a few days before we knew for sure that after the season that he was going to stay. So things maybe are a little tighter, but I don't think the leash is going to be long if things go downhill in year one for Caleb. Did you know learning actually makes a sound? It's true. Listen. That's the sound of you learning a new language with Babbel. There's been an increase in effort to scout for international talent to bring to the league. In no time, the sport we love will be loved by the entire world. Imagine flying out to games abroad and watching football with fans from other nationalities. So don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Spend the dollars on plane tickets instead and choose Babbel. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Babbel's convenient courses have helped me learn real-life conversation skills in a different language. It's easy to prep for my next trip abroad. Learning how to ask for directions, how to order food, and speak to merchants without having to consult language apps while I'm on vacation is priceless. Plus, they have speech recognition technology that helps improve your pronunciation and accent. If this sounds good to you, download Babbel. There's a special limited time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/thepass. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/thepass, spelled BABBEL.com/thepass. Rules and restrictions may apply.
The expectations are higher for this team, the Saints, as Dennis Allen's second go-around as head coach has gone better than the first time. Of course, he coached the Raiders a decade ago, and it didn't exactly go well, 8-28 there. But he is 16-18 as coach of the Saints. They went 7-10 his first season, 9-8 this past year, but did not make the playoffs. And I think that's where this is one, Dylan, where it's his third season now. The roster, we can actually tie this into, we can kind of tie this into a quarterback too, if we want to just go ahead and do that, because, Derek Carr's there. And I think both of these guys are kind of in a very pressure packed situation. Because remember, we're not just talking about a team that hasn't had success, for a long time and they're trying to find the year. We're talking about the Saints who, were having a lot of success, feeling like they got to the playoffs frequently. But kind of taking a little bit of a step back. They're in the NFC South, and you feel like there's opportunity there right now, given the coaching changes in a couple other places we talked about in Carolina, Atlanta. So, this is a big year, I think, for Dennis Allen and Derek Carr because, again, coach and quarterback kind of go hand in hand, and we'll see. I think they need to break through and make the playoffs for that pressure to sort of start to go away a bit.
Yeah, you'll find out that the NFC South is popular on our quarterback hot seat list. But yes. Derek, like you said, they go hand in hand. I mean, it wasn't overly surprising to see what happened in year one in terms of them being competent, but not great. I think it's a roster that, as we've discussed a number of times, and they have a lot of guys that have been there a while on defense at this point, but it's just a group that still is it doesn't have the depth that it once did. They continually are known for kicking the can down the road with the cap and pushing money into the future, and it's kind of starting to cost them, but not really. But to the point where it's like it's just kind of the place you don't want to be when you're a fan of a team or a team in general, is being kind of in the middle where you're not bad enough to be able to regroup and rebuild and get the draft picks that you need to get some solid talent in there. At the same time, you're not quite good enough to really feel like anything, at least in their case, winning the division is possible. But what is your ceiling from there? How far do you really realistically see this team going in the postseason? And I have a hard time imagining this team going up against Detroit or San Francisco, just let's say those two in particular, and finding a way through them. It seems unlikely to me. Even winning the division might be tough. We saw it. Yes, they were in the mix last year. A couple things go their way differently, and they're actually making it. But what does that mean? It wasn't like Derek Carr again looked created all 2016s long ago when that Raiders offense was really kicking under him. And I know he looked pretty solid just a few years ago when they made the playoffs in 2021. But it's just at that point with some of the playmakers they had, things were cooking a bit differently than here, where you just, I don't know, the offensive line isn't quite where it used to be either. It's just a group that's kind of become a little stale, and even from from Saints fans, it does feel like there's a little more just fatigue and maybe just kind of like, I'm going to be focused on other things, enjoy the league at large, because it's just not the most exciting group. And I think Dennis Allen, I know we put him on the hot seat. I think he's, unless something crazy happens, I think this is his last year. It's almost like that feels like one of the more obvious ones. But yeah, it's really Derek Carr that has to prove that he's a guy, because they have I think they have an out in his contract fairly soon, at least where it's not going to be as crazy with the dead money. So it's now or never for him. And then you start looking at what's happened to some of these quarterbacks that don't make it work with the first team they get to. Russell Wilson get another chance, obviously, in Pittsburgh right now. But yeah, it becomes a little bit quicker. Yeah, the out's not until 2026 actually, so they might be stuck with them for one more year. But still, I think the hot seat, and they drafted Spencer Rattler. Will the calls for him to get some playing time in the middle of late season get loud if they're kind of struggling? We'll find out. But it's definitely a situation with New Orleans where maybe expectations for the division are still there, but I don't know, man. I still think I would take Tampa or Atlanta over them at this point. I'm just not as convinced of what's going to be happening with the Saints this year.
Well, we've saved the best for last, because nowhere else in the NFL would a coach that has gone 12-5 in 3 straight seasons be on such a hot seat. But we know that Mike McCarthy is, because he coaches the Dallas Cowboys. And yes, they went 6-10 in his first season, but as I mentioned, 12-5 each of the past 3 seasons. The problem is the playoffs, where they've only won 1 playoff game during his tenure in 4 years. And I think that is what they hired him for, was to try to get the Cowboys back to the promised land. That was the whole goal. It has not happened yet. And so, again, the Cowboys can go 12-5 again this year. They go 13-4. They go 14-3. I don't think we know Mike McCarthy's future until they have a playoff game, or if they don't have a playoff game, then we know he's not going to be back. So this was pretty straightforward to me. Like, we know it seemed like they were close to a split after last season. And so if they don't make the playoffs, and I don't know, Dylan, like is winning multiple games, maybe like the depending on where they finish, I guess. I mean, if they get to bye, hey, maybe they get to the championship game, it's okay. But I feel like that's the only resolution here that's going to bring him back next season.
It's pretty nuts. Like you said, only in Dallas would you have this kind of conversation about a guy that has won so many games. A lot of teams would be very happy with the situation. I think it goes kind of maybe trickles down to the questions with Dak and his contract and those kind of things. And it's like, all right, if we can't make this work now, what are we going to do after this? I think it's hard to say that they're not hand in hand a little bit, but yeah, it's been a team that, at times in the regular season looks dominant. They had some wins last year where they absolutely ran teams up and down the field. And they also had games against, I think, the Buffalo game and obviously the playoff game against the Packers, where teams got a little heavier, a little more 12 personnel, 2 tight ends, and their defense did not adapt. They are definitely built to face 11. You saw when they played the Rams before Stafford's injury, with the way that they were able to have success in stopping that offense that was so efficient for most of the year whenever Stafford and a lot of those guys were healthy. But then, Buffalo and Green Bay in particular, they got kind of exposed. And I think it's that lack, like you said, of playoff success, and especially running into, the previous 2 seasons against San Francisco, where you felt like, especially a couple of years ago, they had some opportunities and they just could not score, right? The defense played really well in that game in San Francisco in the divisional round after they ended Tom Brady's career with that, the one playoff win there against Tampa. But it just, really last year in particular against the Packers, everything that Dan Quinn had kind of put together on that defense kind of fell apart quickly. Now we get Mike Zimmer back, which will be interesting to see what he's able to do with this defense, and a team that they still have, they need to stay healthy on defense in their secondary. We looked at when they lost Trayvon Diggs, how much that hurt them. Deron Bland was not able to hold up by himself with some of the other guys. there. It still has, obviously, any team that has Micah Parsons is going to feel pretty good about things, but you're seeing some interesting, I don't know if you've seen some of the little back and forth kind of bickering between Malik Hooker and him about his kind of questioning Micah's focus, I think because of some podcasting or gaming or something that he was doing. Interesting kind of stuff going on. But then, there's also the reports with McCarthy just of the discontent maybe with the executives, and maybe the relationship there has soured overall. So it does feel like what you said. I think championship game or bust, and it's crazy given their success. But I think part of it's because maybe Jerry feels like we're still a pretty dang good spot. I don't know if they will be as good if they're not able to keep Dak. We'll see how that situation plays out over the course of the year. But maybe that factors in where they still think, all right, if this doesn't work, there's a lot of other candidates out there that would love to be in this position. Maybe that won't end up being the case. We'll find out. But for McCarthy, it's a tough spot because you win these games, but you do feel like at times with against Shanahan twice and against LaFleur that he's getting a little bit out coached in these postseasons, or at least his staffs are. And they're just not making the most maybe of the talent in those spots. You could also argue those teams are really good, the 49ers and Packers last year, especially the way the Packers came out in the second half of the season, and Jordan Love in particular, his development. It's tough, but that's the NFL, and especially like you said with the star, it's a little bit different, the expectations there.
That's a list of 5 coaches. Again, I think they're, you can make an argument with some other guys to be in that conversation, but those seem to be the leading 5. There's potential hot seat quarterbacks. We did talk about, Derek Carr kind of tying him into the Dennis Allen situation. But as you said, if there's a kind of a theme when it comes to the NFC South, Bryce Young, and again, he's in boy, it's wild, right? Because remember, we're talking about a guy who was just the number 1 overall pick, but did not go well last year. I think, again, part of that, as you mentioned, may have been supporting cast related, but it was just not what it needed to be. And now he enters a very important season. Again, he's got a new coach coming in, and I don't know, Dylan, this one's one where I'm just like, I don't know what to expect. Like, I have no idea what to expect from the Panthers. And I don't really know what to expect from Bryce Young for that reason. And I think it's clearly something where when you are a number 1 pick, the expectations are extremely high to produce results, and they didn't get the results last year. So that pressure's there going into year 2, whether fair or unfair.
Yeah, it might be a little unfair. I think 3 years is probably what I would say is fair, but even then you got to put more talent around him. I think they attempted to do that. I think Deontay Johnson, his ability to get open over the middle of the field should jive well with what Bryce does. Obviously bring in Leggett. I do think they've tried to address that position a bit more than in the past, and still have questions though for this offensive line. I love Austin Corbett, but overall this group outside of that hasn't really inspired there's some average play, but a lot of the numbers show that this is still a below average line, and you just worry about what that's going to mean for Bryce and how much it would help if he had a more competent group of guys blocking when he's passing plays. In particular, Jonathan Brooks comes in, though. I think they're going to try to get creative to open things up and try to take some of the pressure off Bryce. But he's got to at least take a step forward. I think if it's as bad as last year, even if it's unfair, given he was number 1 pick, will the blame go on the coaches? Or you start to say, all right, it's a new staff, new things are being tried out, and it's still not working, and more pass catchers. Then it starts heating up a bit. I don't know if they would move. I don't think he deserves. Again, I think going to year 3 is maybe where you start to, when we've seen it with guys like Zach Wilson or some other top quarterbacks. Some guys never really even get a chance. To be fair, they're in the top 3 or so. Look at what happened in San Francisco with Trey Lance. But it's tough. It's a tough business, but unfortunately for Bryce, I think it's magnified, as we've discussed before, by what CJ Stroud did. Obviously, the situation, and you talk about another group of pass catchers that are thought of as potentially maybe one of the best duos in the league now. And obviously the creativity of Bobby Slowick. I think Carolina saw that they had that opportunity, and there was a little bit back and forth of little rumors that Frank Reich really wanted CJ, and there's a kind of a mess there. And now, things better work quickly. And fair or not, like you said, it's just a lot of pressure on Bryce to at least take it from where it was. And we've seen a lot of quarterbacks after really bad rookie years have at least solid or see improvement in year two. I think it just needs to have some level of improvement where this is a competent offense and not the bottom of the league. I'm not even saying they need to be league average, but maybe somewhere in the 20s in points per drive and DVOA, those kind of things would be a success story for Bryce.
Another guy that feels like he has a lot to prove, and it's not ideal probably coming off of an ACL tear, and that's Daniel Jones, who we know will be and already has been kind of spotlighted on Hard Knocks, and will certainly, I think, have even more eyeballs on him because of that going into the season for the Giants. And I mean, I think, Dylan, it's fair because outside of the one season, right? And remember, this is not all on Daniel Jones too. Like it's also been a supporting cast issue, I think, without question at times for him outside of Saquon. I don't think there's any doubt. But the difference is this year, they went out and got Malik Neighbors, who, feels like a future superstar. They're going to add him to the mix, and that supporting cast looks better from a wide receiver standpoint than it has, perhaps. And there seems like there's higher potential. Running back wise, they've got Devin Singletary, but there is no Saquon. So, and you are talking about a guy coming off an injury. And so, I mean, overall, the record, 22, 36, and 1. That's Daniel Jones's record in the NFL. And, 1-5 last year before he gets hurt. And so, yeah, like I think it's one where, percentages have gone up, but it is about winning, and it's about kind of seeing what you can do with a better, again, group around you. And I think at least from a pass catching standpoint, they now have a superstar in Malik Neighbors, and that does put a lot of pressure on a guy that's coming off of an ACL tear.
Yeah, it's a ton of pressure. It's been building even before the last time there was a lot of pressure there. Like you mentioned, there was probably that 1 year where they were successful enough to get in the postseason and win a playoff game. Things, we talked about that whole year, though, that the numbers show that they weren't exactly the strongest team in the league, that their record was a bit better than their play really had indicated. And that played out in that playoff loss to Philadelphia. I know they've wrapped up last season beating them. A little bit of carrot on top to finish the year. But yeah, overall, a pretty disastrous season for a team that we talked about the Jets finishing last in DVOA just under Carolina, but it was the Giants in 30th. They're not far behind. New England's right in that group. Not surprising. But the Giants definitely, with Danny Dimes, need to, at least with Neighbors, figure out something, because it became like we saw some good stuff and the creativity with Daboll immediately in 2022. They were a fun team. They won some close games, and that's that leads to the record being a little bit better maybe than the play was. But at least you did see the positive direction, and all of that came crashing down. Yeah, you question the weapons. That offensive line was, man. I think it was the first Dallas game where they got just blown away, and it felt like every time Daniel Jones was getting dropping back, he was getting sacked. It was on Monday Night Football, I want to say, or Sunday Night Football, and he got sacked like 10 times. It was absolutely ridiculous. I know Andrew Thomas is solid. They have Runyon, but Evan Neal needs to step up and be better. Overall, this line needs to be better. They need to find different ways to be more creative with maybe just max protecting at times and letting Neighbors just do his thing. But yeah, I do still question. We didn't see the Hyatt take like a major step as a rookie, so we'll see what he does. I still think there's some good things that Slayton can do, maybe more as a number 2 if Neighbors can really take on the number 1 role. They have Wan'Dale Robinson, and interesting group, but I still think that you're lacking maybe that true number 2. If Slayton can do it, I think that will be a huge step forward for them. But losing Saquon, I mean, we looked at last year's team and what how they looked with and without him. And I know you were watching the offseason Giants, and they talk about the same kind of thing, right? How important he was as the focal point. They have Singletary, but coming in, but I still question that's all going to look like. The defense might need to, I know we're talking about Daniel Jones here, but the defense might need to really step up to help him have some opportunities too. They weren't exactly perfect last year. They bring in Brian Burns, and you start looking at this defensive line and thinking, okay, they can maybe start cause some issues if the DBs don't cover well. That's going to be a problem. But I think for Jones himself and what he can control, hopefully the defense puts him in decent places to succeed, but not always starting deep in his own half of the field. But I still have a few questions about where this team can go just because of the offensive line and losing Saquon, even with Neighbors. If it doesn't have any little of progress from last year, then it's going to become definitely the pressure on Daniel Jones more so than maybe some other groups, members of the organization at this point.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, there's pressure definitely for a lot of people, I think, with the Giants heading into the season. All right. And we can kind of wrap up with these guys because these are all kind of the established older guys of the group. We know Kirk Cousins in Atlanta is just like, we've talked ad nauseum about the Michael Penix draft choice and what that could mean for Cousins. And he just got there and he's already feeling the pressure. Like who knows how that plays out. Russell Wilson gets a change of scenery in Pittsburgh. And again, who knows how that plays out too, just based on what we've seen from Russell Wilson in recent years. And then you've got a team like the Dolphins with Tua. And again, the Dolphins are just expecting to kind of do what they did for a good chunk of last season, is just go out, score people, and be just a prolific offense. But that is going to come with pressure, just because, like we said, it is kind of a scenario now where I think Dolphins fans and probably more want to see this turn into actual postseason success. And so I think of that group, Tua maybe feeling the least pressure, but man, it is kind of wild to see, Kirk Cousins, Russell Wilson, the situations they've now found themselves in. We see kind of what the pressure level is for those two guys.
Yeah, I think for Tua, the pressure is, I just throw him on there more so because I think it's going to come down again to what happens late in the season in the playoffs. Obviously Tua was able to prove he's able to stay healthy this past season, but they go to Kansas City and that defense is playing great, as we know, and the elements played into it. But I think it's starting to be that kind of unfair. We see the success, but then in the moments against the big teams, not the same thing as what's the pressure of Dallas or anything, but it has some similarities in terms of like, this is unfair, but nonetheless, the conversation's still there. There was a lot of more of the talking head kind of folks saying like, who's going to be Mike McDaniel's Matthew Stafford, comparing Tua to Jared Goff and what happened with the Rams and them getting stagnant. I don't know if that's really fair. And obviously Jared's doing quite well in Detroit right now. But I think with Tua, there's still going to be, if it's more of a preemptive kind of, if they struggle, and this is a really tough AFC as we talked about, if the offense doesn't have the same prolific numbers, if they kind of take a step back more towards the middle of the pack and are fighting to get in the playoffs rather than, being in the lead of the division for most of last year before things fell apart at the end and Buffalo's comeback. I think the questions will start to get louder. Right now, they maybe aren't as high, but there was a point, where those kind of things were being discussed about what is the next level of this Dolphins offense with someone else. And it's hard to find. Don't find a lot of Matthew Stafford just waiting to be traded. But yeah, with Kirk Cousins, I would not have put him on here if they didn't draft Penix, right? Like it's like squarely because of that. Yeah, it's now the pressure kind of ramps up. On him, I think there probably wasn't much pressure on him, especially this, maybe like if they didn't have a successful year this year, we would have looked at next season and been like, all right, now he's got some pressure with that contract, the way it works out with it's really kind of a 2-year kind of guarantee kind of deal. But now with Penix bringing in, everything he does is going to be under the microscope, from a national level more than usual for the Falcons, where the attention, because of just how much, media buzz and just fan buzz and everything, and the shock kind of factor of the Penix pick in the moment it's made this a storyline that everyone's going to be following. So unfairly or not, Kirk will be under the microscope a bit. And then, Russell, his is an interesting one. I don't know. It's like the pressure's there, but it's kind of like the pressure was maybe higher in Pittsburgh in Denver at this point. It's kind of like, if we get anything that looks like the old Russ, it's gravy, and we're not maybe having as high of expectations. Maybe that's not the same thing that can be said of the Steelers themselves, but there's still the pressure there because they did bring in an insurance policy and Justin Fields. So I think with Arthur Smith too, I know there was a lot of people when Justin was coming out of the draft and just in general, even after some of the initial struggles in Chicago, that pointed to Atlanta and the system that Arthur had with the rushing attack and what that could have meant for how that could work out well with Fields. So there's kind of those questions still that are going to remain, and I know they might plan to use them in some special packages when they get close to the red zone and just different parts of the field. But I think that's where the pressure is on Russell more so than say like expectation wise. It's just more of the pressure of maintaining a job as one of the 32 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. It's not going to be easy, but it's a good situation to be in. I think his offensive line is going to be better than what he had at times in Denver. Not Denver. I think that line has improved, but still the Pittsburgh really with their first 2 picks, finding hopefully a tackle of the future and Fontenot, and then getting Zach Frazier in the second. He's already slotted in to start at center. They also drafted guard in the 4th and Mason McCormick. I mean, they really went hard on that because that was such a focal point of this franchise for a long time, that for the years under Roethlisberger, yes, a lot was made of, he had some really talented pass catchers, and Roethlisberger himself is a Hall of Famer, but they had a great offensive line. I think they've done a good job addressing that. So I do think that in itself, bringing in Roman Wilson, interesting kind of guy to open up some space and help get some yards after the catch for either of these quarterbacks. Obviously, we know what Pickens can still do. Questions about Van, how much effective he can be. I know some struggles with the Falcons after being traded by the Rams, but I think Russell it'll be interesting. But I think maybe because the expectations aren't as high, maybe he doesn't feel like, and there was just that butting of heads, especially last year with Sean Payton. I don't think he ever had any cohesion there. So hopefully for him, there'll be a little bit more of that here. And Russell will be able to have some success in a really talk about, I feel like every division we're talking about in the AFC is tough, but probably the toughest division in the entire NFL in the AFC North. They're going to need Russell to step up and make at times elevate this group and not just be a product of it if they're going to win some games against the Bengals, the Browns, and of course the Ravens.
Yeah, and as always, we have just a couple guys listed here on the quarterbacks, but every quarterback's feeling pressure except for maybe a select few heading into the season, just because we know that's the position that gets the most focus. And we'll see how it plays out for some of these guys that certainly are on a much hotter seat than others heading into the season. But there we go, Dylan. Some thoughts on the hot seat scenarios for certain coaches and quarterbacks heading into the 2024 season. Of course, a lot of stuff already out there to get people ready for the start of the new season over Clutch Points. Let everybody know where they can find all that.
Yeah, you can go to the Clutch Points app to our NFL section or clutchpoints.com to the NFL section. Yeah, tons of starting to get into our preview stuff, looking at already at cut candidates, looking at undrafted guys that have a chance to make some of these rosters, looking at guys that could be trade targets before the season, last minute free agency addition. So all sorts of stuff. We'll get into a lot of our fantasy previews coming up. The player profiles first. We wait till a little bit closer into August to get to more of the player by player positional rankings. A lot of good stuff though. Excited for training camps to get started so we'll have all our coverage of all that. Obviously we go really hard at reading into every little quote, different things that might be necessary to help you have a tell about someone that's going to have a little more value than their ADP might be indicating. All the sort of things we'll be trying to keep you tuned into at Clutch Points.
Yep, check it all out there. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, search for Establish the Pass. And thanks as always for listening to the podcast. We'll talk to you next time here on the Establish the Pass podcast.